heaven and earth than are dreamt of in our philosophy.
There are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamt of in our philosophy.
Hello and welcome to Sinclair Investigates. A while ago I came across a truly fascinating story that could certainly benefit from a proper investigation. At the heart of it is a simple computer, but a computer that seemingly acted as a kind of message hub for communications through time. From medieval England with threats, blackmail and betrayal, and from warring entities in the future able to control reality. And, caught in the middle, some unlucky folk in the present who did nothing more than borrow a computer with no idea of what they were getting into. The vertical plane, their account of the so-called Dodleston mysteries, is quite intriguing. I'll put a link to it in the description. But at about 350 pages, dense pages, it does sometimes feel like a jigsaw puzzle without the picture on the box to help us. And my job today, after studying it intensely for over a year with the help of expert linguists, scientists and paranormal researchers, is to show you that picture, the full picture, and in depth. And although most of the reviews on YouTube and the internet dismiss the story as nothing more than a hoax, I'm not entirely convinced, because though we will look closely at the possibility of a hoax, either fooling the authors or by the authors fooling us, we've noticed evidence that's been overlooked, cryptic clues, including ones hidden in the messages, that are so compelling that they seem to shine a completely different light on the whole story, raising questions like, is it possible that we're looking at future entities running an extraordinary experiment with time, manipulating it, conflating the past, the present and the future, and then using the modern-day folk as guinea pigs to be messed with, and their reactions observed and recorded? Or are we dealing with extraterrestrials figuring out how intelligent or gullible us sentient inhabitants of Earth are for some hidden reasons? And were either of these also using their communications to give us warnings, with examples, about our mistakenly thinking that knowledge is the same as wisdom, a blindness that could bring about the end of humanity itself? Or were they nothing more than just malicious poltergeists, having fun at the modern-day folks' expense? And so that you too can spot the clues, I'll present that full picture, including seemingly for the first time ever, revealing a secret code hidden in plain sight about the meaning of the Dodleston mysteries. So first the story, and then in the final 3 episodes, like detectives, we'll gather those clues and see what conclusions we can draw. So let's take a look. Cheshire, a charming English county, famed for its glorious rolling countryside of gentle hills and checkerboard fields, its fine Tudor mansions like the magnificent Little Morton Hall, and, in some ways appropriate to the bizarre story we're about to investigate, the birthplace of Lewis Carroll and his mad, mad world of Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, with its grinning Cheshire cat. But, as we'll see, Ken Webster, a young resident of Cheshire and a respected economics teacher, certainly wasn't grinning after borrowing a computer from his school, the highly regarded Harden High School, one of the oldest schools in Wales and founded in 1606. What he saw on the screen changed his life and potentially challenges our understanding of time and how it might be manipulated, for good or for ill. Ken lived at Meadow Cottage in the ancient village of Dodleston. The cottage was built in the 1700s, replacing the original building that had been burnt to the ground about 200 years earlier, following beliefs that its occupant was communicating with devils through a mysterious box of lights, or as we know it, a computer. Our story begins in late autumn 1984. Ken had invited his girlfriend, Debbie Oakes, a bright and sensitive young lady, to move in and help with renovating the cottage. and one day footprints, each with 6 toes, were seen on one of the recently plastered walls. Thinking they were nothing more than dusty smudges from the renovations, Debbie painted them over. But the next morning the footprints were back, and bizarrely tins of cat food, shopping that they'd left unpacked, were found neatly piled on the kitchen table. "Ah, just a ghost with 12 toes and a serious case of OCD," joked Ken. "Nothing to worry about." How wrong he was. In December 1984, Nicola Bagley, a close friend, had come to stay with them for a while. She had ambitions of being a writer, and so, to help her, Ken borrowed a BBC Micro Model B from the school, plus a monochrome green monitor, a printer, and a 5¼ inch floppy disk drive. The Beeb, as it was affectionately known, was a marvel of its time. Let me just pop on an anti-static glove, and we'll have a look at mine. Switch it off first, remove the top case, shift the keyboard. We can see that a Beeb has what's known as open architecture, where users were encouraged to expand its functionality by inserting EEPROM chips that were loaded with programs, like this one, Edword, a word processor. Let's put it into this empty slot. Make sure the pins are straight. Now gently rocking it into place. And there we are, a new program installed. Pop it back together. Switch it on. And fire up our new chip, our new program. So, star, Edword, press return, and we get to the menu. Type C for create, give the new document a name, so H will do, press return. And there we are, a blank word processing document. Now let's return to the prompt screen. Of course, it's primitive by modern standards, with our user-friendly icons and drop-down menus. For example, although starting up Edword, like we've done, is pretty simple, all the commands and formatting, bold, margins, save, print and so on, has to be done with codes that we just have to remember. But Nick was delighted, fired up Edword and started to do some writing, occasionally having to consult the manual for those user-slightly unfriendly commands. One Sunday evening, Ken, Debbie and Nick decided to visit a friend, and when they returned 3 hours later, Nick went to the computer, which she left on, and found a file that she didn't recognize. Ken, Deb, Nick, true are the nightmares of a person that fears, safe are the bodies of the silent world. Turn, pretty flower, turn towards the sun, for you shall grow and sow. But the flower reaches too high and withers in the burning light. Get out your bricks! Pussycat, pussycat went to London to seek fame and fortune. Faith must not be lost, for this shall be your redeemer, L.W. What on earth was that? And where had it come from? How did the author know their names? And apart from the fortune cookie platitudes and bits of children's rhymes, what was meant by "get out your bricks"? Was this some kind of threat? By the way, this strange phrase, "get out your bricks," in shouty capitals, is actually our very first cryptic clue, planted there deliberately by someone or something to give us a hint about the true meaning of the Dodleston mysteries, and we'll investigate it closely in the conclusions. Anyway, unsettled by the mysterious message, Ken returned the computer to the school. Late December. Christmas was drawing near, and Nick left to spend the holidays with her family. She was particularly glad to do so, as the previous day they'd noticed sudden drops in temperature in Meadow Cottage, along with inexplicable gusts of wind, and had found more items stacked on the kitchen table. Debbie, though a little concerned, was fascinated by these goings-on, as she'd long been interested in matters paranormal. By early February 1985, Nick had returned, and so that she could carry on with her writing, Ken borrowed another BBC Micro. The Red Lion, a charming pub or tavern in Dodleston, still thriving and popular amongst locals and visitors, was a favourite haunt of theirs. One frosty night they'd gone there for fish, chips and a drink or two, warming themselves in front of an open log fire. After returning, Nick noticed another unfamiliar file, seemingly and rather bizarrely written in medieval English. I'll show you the original, and, like the others that follow, I'll translate verbally, word for word where possible, so you can easily follow and understand the ancient text.
What strange words you speak! You are a noble man who has a beautiful woman who live in my house. I have seen many alterations. It is a decorous place, with lights which the devil makes, and costly things that only my friend Edmund Grey can afford, or the king himself. It was a great crime to have stolen my house. L.W.
Someone had evidently broken into the cottage while they were away, and had left this strange, rather threatening message. Someone who seemingly had overheard their conversations. The message suggested that Ken had somehow stolen the author's house. Perhaps that's what "get out your bricks" had meant in that first message. Get out of my house. Very odd. At school, the senior English teacher, Peter Trinder, looked at the printout, said that the text was in Middle English, and though he agreed it was just a hoax, asked to see any other messages that might appear. 9th of February 1985. A friend, John Cummins, visited the cottage and suggested that they reply to the message and see what happened. So they wrote to L.W., asking some questions, including when he'd lived at the cottage, the name of the reigning king, and who was his friend Edmund Grey. Next day, a reply.
Edmund Grey, brother of John Grey, lives at Kinnerton Hall. The king, of course, is Henry VIII, who is 46. Signed, L.W. 28 March of the year 1521.
1521? Well, that was a bit of a shock. Anyway, after Ken had read the printout to John Cummins over the phone, he went back to the computer, but the file had disappeared. In the school staff room next day, he handed a copy to Peter. Rubbish, said Peter. As a local historian, he knew that Kinnerton Hall, shown here with its superb 3 Dutch gables, hadn't been built until 1685, over 100 years later. Furthermore, if Henry VIII was 46, 6 and 40, then because the king had been born in 1491, the date should have been 1537, not 1521 as in the message. Obviously, this led them to think that the whole thing was just a fraud by someone who couldn't even be bothered to check the facts. Though, to be fair, there was a question mark after Kinnerton Hall and after the date 1521. By adding these question marks, was this mysterious L.W. dropping some kind of hint? Curious to see if they noticed the errors and how they'd react. But why would he do that? 16th of February. More things had been stacked up in the kitchen, and on the computer screen a new message. In it, L.W. said about his farmhouse, it has red sandstone footings, possibly to prove that he was telling the truth, something they could check. And most important of all, he signed off not as L.W., but as Lukas. Now, Meadow Cottage did have red sandstone footings, but that didn't actually prove anything. During the renovations, the ancient foundations, dating from Lukas's time, had been partially excavated and left outside, so anyone could have seen them, including a potential hoaxer. A couple of days later, Ken and a friend were playing drums and guitar in the living room. Debbie joined in on her saxophone. And that evening, another message came through from Lukas. He addressed Ken as,
My good friend,
and said,
My writing machine is a wonderful thing, somewhat unnatural.
Adding,
Your merrymaking pleases me, but it is somewhat annoying at times.
And asked,
Will you tell your woman to play more of her flute thing? It is a beautiful sound, I think.
And signed off with his full name.
Lukas Wainman.
Now, obviously, this raised a serious question. Who had been listening to their merrymaking? Was there a stalker in the village trying to freak them out? Or if they really were communicating with someone from the distant past, what was this writing machine? The first writing machines, typewriters, weren't around until the 1800s. Anyway, the school needed Ken's writing machine back, so he returned it, though kept the floppy disk containing the messages, and decided to visit nearby Chester Library. He wanted to see if he could find any mention of Lucas Wainman, Edmund Gray, and possibly an older Kinnerton Hall. The librarian said that coincidentally someone else had been inquiring about old Dodleston too. The hoaxer, perhaps? But as regards the information, Ken drew a blank, so returned home none the wiser. 21st of February. Ken and Debbie visited their friend, John Cummins. He'd just bought Colin Wilson's book, Poltergeist, and wondered if they were being visited by these mischievous or sometimes malicious entities, particularly as he'd found out that 2 ley lines, energy highways, passed directly through Dodleston village. In his book, Colin Wilson said that poltergeists are thought to feed upon anxieties, which sometimes they themselves cause. And certainly Ken and Debbie were concerned about what was going on. Wilson also wrote that he'd had reports of poltergeists transmitting writings from long-dead people, usually through automatic writing, but also as marks on walls, but in messages on computers. A week later, following heightened poltergeist activity, if that was what it was, including items moving in their presence when their backs were turned, Debbie's initial fascination turned to anxiety, and so, with Ken's help, moved out, renting a house in neighbouring East Green. They hadn't split up, she just needed a break, though Ken, understandably, was beginning to worry that the disruption could be threatening their relationship. He returned home to find something very concerning. The floppy disk containing Lucas's messages had been moved from the windowsill to the kitchen table. Was Lucas hinting that he wanted the computer to be brought back so they could carry on chatting? And if so, how had he moved the disk? Travelling through time as well? One way to find out. Ken borrowed another Beeb and wrote to Lucas, but very politely, because if Lucas had moved that disk, then seemingly he was able to materialise in their time. Not necessarily a good thought. 2nd of March 1985. At the beginning of Lucas's next message, he protested,
"Have I not been friendly with you? And yet, unless I'm mistaken, I think there is not enough trust."
How had Lucas picked up on Ken's concerns? But then Lucas softened, adding,
"Nor do I have an explanation for why you be in my house. But you are a noble visitor, and you may stay as long as you like. My servant thinks that you be all in my head. He also says that my blood be poisoned, and that it be my weak-hinged imagination. But lunatic I am not, I think, and he must keep it secret till I write my book. I have had some mishaps with your device, but it does amuse."
What was this device? Though it was outrageous to think so, did Lucas, nearly 450 years earlier, also have a BBC micro? He called the device a Leem's Boist, literally translated as light's box, perhaps referring to the Beeb's LEDs, or perhaps an illuminated display, a monitor maybe. And what book was he writing? Was he making notes on his experiences with them? Ken had written to Lucas about modern times, including mentioning cars. Lucas thought he was joking and said,
"I think you jest when you talk about your horseless cart, Tiger. It's good that we can be relaxed and joke like this."
Playing along with him, Ken cut out a magazine photograph of a Jaguar XJ Coupe and left it on the monitor. And the next day he found the photograph still there, but partly burnt, and on the computer a message that read,
"My good friend, I have found the portrayal of your cart, but it is a crude thing, for without your horse it shall not go far."
Lucas then gave details of his education and the books he'd studied, something that Ken could check. Lucas confided that, though he'd been happy moving to Cheshire,
"Now things have changed, for my undesirable King Sheriff does plague me so. I think he is here every turn of my glass.
or every hour.
My King Sheriff is Tom Foulhurst."
Although Lucas had said this almost as an afterthought, Ken was concerned, and he was right. Ultimately, the sheriff's involvement would affect the rest of their brief time together. It was Peter who delivered the blow. Increasingly, Ken had come to believe that Lukas was real, particularly when he mentioned his understandable confusion with the device, the computer, presumably. But the college that Lukas claimed to have attended, Jesus College, Oxford, hadn't actually been built until after the death of the supposedly reigning King Henry VIII. So yes, said Peter, it was just a badly researched hoax. But Ken still wasn't sure, so just wrote, "Thank you." Earlier, Lukas had said that he'd felt there wasn't enough trust being shown to him. But presumably, under the stress of the sheriff's involvement, it was now he who felt no trust for them.
"My friend, pray what strange demon are you? I am so confused. You are, I think, a noble man, but your lies terrify me much. I have no wish to accuse you, but you said also that you are a learned man. But you do not mention my misspelt words. If you were alive, you would say you know not of my Jesus College."
So had Lukas been testing them, as before, seeing if they spotted the deliberate mistakes? Then he ended,
"It is not I that makes you afraid. It is you that makes myself afraid."
To Lukas, Ken's ignorance showed that they were the hoaxers, devilish hoaxers, not he. Lukas went on to say that he'd actually attended Brasenose College, Oxford, to become a priest at the university, and, as proof, gave them details of an inscription above the college fireplace. By the way, you may have noticed my wedding ring. I'll show you a close-up without the hand wrinkles. It's a medieval priest ring made from cast iron. Iron was thought to protect the wearer against evil spirits, and Lukas, following his studies, would certainly have worn something very like it. 11th of March. Anyway, not knowing what to write, they waited, and eventually another message came through demanding to know who their friend Peter was. That night, the poltergeist activity got worse and worse. They needed help. So Peter suggested that they contact the highly respected Society for Psychical Research. A week later, Debbie was alone in the cottage, warming herself by the fire. She heard tapping noises from the kitchen. Suddenly she felt a prickly coldness, her hair being tugged, her shoulder gripped, and sensed the shadowy presence of a man nearby. Terrified, she ran outside into the pouring rain and waited for Ken to come home. And, on his return, she said that she'd leave permanently if anything like that happened again. Their relationship was at its lowest ebb. Ken wrote back to Lukas, saying that Peter was a close friend who'd be visiting soon and, like Lukas, had attended an Oxford college. Perhaps that alma mater connection would give Lukas some reassurance. 31st of March. Debbie had the shock of her life. Lukas appeared to her through some kind of time portal, perhaps. She was reading Colin Wilson's book Poltergeist. A flash of white light, a pulse of surging incandescent green, and a man appeared, poorly dressed and petrified. He looked around. Nothing was familiar. Then he saw her, tried to speak, but no sound came from him. And later that evening, Lukas wrote,
"I did see a fair maid,"
and that
"it did so frighten me to see her suddenly appear."
1st of April 1985. Being a practical-minded chap, Peter decided to drive over 150 miles to Brasenose College to check out Lukas's description of the wording above the fireplace, and also to see if anyone called Wayneman had attended in the early 1500s. He discovered that the foundation stone, with its inscription, was above the stairs, not over the fireplace, as Lukas had said. However, the librarian, Robin Peedle, couldn't find any mention anywhere of a medieval student called Wayneman. But, intrigued by Peter's story about Lukas, he promised to do some more research. One evening, a few days later, Peter pointed out the error about the inscription's location to Lukas, who, early next morning, replied,
"I did make a mistake about the words placed above the fireplace. It is my poor memory. The words are above the first stairs."
He then quoted them accurately, apart from a few minor bits that he couldn't clearly remember. Again, I'll translate. In the year of Christ, 1509, and Henry VIII's first year, In the name of God, Lincoln the Bishop and also Sutton laid this stone in agreement with the authority of the King. 1st day of June. Now a hoaxer wishing to cover his tracks could have travelled to Oxford to copy down the correct inscription or visit the college library, but overnight, a 320-mile round trip. That's an extremely determined hoaxer. Or perhaps something very different was going on, and only someone with a specialised knowledge of highly complex medieval abbreviations could have made sense of it. Which brings us back inevitably to Lukas. Certainly none of the 1980s folk would have had a clue what was written there. 10th of April. Lukas had visited a friend in nearby Stockport, a fellow student of religion, who'd warned him about mentioning his connection with what was to them the distant future. He wrote,
"He advised me well. He said that I must not tell a soul of this unknown world and of your people, or else it be nothing less than a capital offence."
A death sentence, in other words, for witchcraft. Lukas said that his friend would visit him soon to see this box of lights for himself, though strangely he now referred to the Leamsboist as a commuter, seemingly copying the word computer as used by Ken and the others. But why would he be making this curious spelling mistake? It does rather look like a deliberate attempt by a hoaxer to make the messages seem more authentic. Or were the messages getting scrambled? Or deliberately altered in some way? 3 days later, the whole mood of the story changed abruptly. Debbie had been reading up about the heavy-handed justice of the early Tudor period, and was telling Ken about it. Torture was commonly used to extract pleas from an uncooperative suspect, where heavier and heavier stones were placed upon their chest until either they confessed or suffocated. It was known as pain forte et dure, pain or punishment strong and hard. Next morning Lukas sent a message betraying his deep anxiety.
"Did I hear you speak of the dreadful pain forte et dure? Why is this? Do you mean to tell the Crown?"
Presumably Lukas was scared that they were going to betray him to the authorities and bring about his execution for witchcraft. Debbie swiftly wrote to reassure him, but she and Ken were far from reassured. This meant that Lukas could definitely overhear their conversations, and of course that would explain how he'd known to correct his errors about the inscription and its location. 16th of April. Lukas's friend arrived and wrote to them. He obviously struggled with the Beeb initially. We'll be taking a closer look at this garbage typing later, but then got the hang of it, saying,
"You are a phantom of great powers. It is my theory that you are to come,"
meaning they came from the future, and
"the fashion of our time be that I will not give mine nor Lucas Wainman's true description and name."
so Lukas was not his real name. Little wonder that they couldn't trace him. And it's certainly true that in those days it was commonly thought that the devil could only take a person's soul if he knew their birth name. 19th of April, but now things went wrong, very wrong. The sheriff had informed the authorities about Lukas's box of lights and his suspicions that Lukas was involved in witchcraft. Lukas's friend, obviously very upset, wrote,
"You are a foolish devil who has brought nothing less than darkness upon the wretch,"
meaning Lukas.
"I hope he comes not to harm, otherwise I guarantee your death by my own hand somehow. It was unavoidable with your magic lights, and now he sits in a dungeon of shame. It will be your ruin unless you help Lukas, for he shall not die if you show yourself to the Crown for what you are and display your powers of devilry. Then his life will be spared."
Ken, Debbie and Peter were horrified. Overt threats and Lukas in prison facing certain death. Ken immediately replied, asking for Lukas's real name. There was a chance that this time they might be able to locate it in the records and even discover Lukas's fate, or, if it were possible to change the past, find some way to rescue him. Though changing the past, as they were to find out, has consequences. In his reply, Ken insisted that he was not a devil, but just an ordinary man, and asked the friend to invite the arresting sheriff, Tom Foulhurst, to speak with him through the computer. Lukas's friend replied, saying that the sheriff would come the following day, but that
You must give your mighty power to him, and he will request pardon for our friend Lukas, and he shall beg the king himself to speak with you.
next day the friend added,
The sheriff does ask that you speak to him by yourself, shown to his eye, rather than through the computer which he cannot see. Otherwise the computer must be taken to Lukas in prison to show he spoke truths. But it is not easy to move your device, for it seems to disappear when any have tried. Only when Lukas is here does it appear as solid.
Ken replied that therefore the sheriff would have no choice but to bring Lukas home and communicate through the box of lights there. 23rd of April. Late evening. Lukas had been allowed to go home briefly. He immediately wrote to Ken, including this very curious statement about the origin of his Leem's Boist, his computer.
My good friend, I know not where I can start to describe my misfortunes, but it is so good I can have your true words once more. I did think much about my box of lights, for it be through this very matter I fear for my life.
Adding that his box of lights
comes not from my nor your time.
Lukas continued, expressing his worries and his desire to record their time together.
I have told my sheriff that though I have seen you many times, and also your sweet maid, you cannot directly speak with them. I said you be of strange description and appearance that would terrify any man. I have so many questions of yourselves for my book. Pray you destroy my writings, for I fear my sheriff may ask for what I have said to you. Your helpless friend, Lukas.
27th of April. And this is when things became very curious, even curiouser than anything before. Lukas wrote,
You said your time is 1985. I thought you were also from 2109, like your friend, who did bring the box of lights.
Their friend from the year 2109? Could this explain how Lukas had known about those two buildings, Kinnison Hall and Jesus College, Oxford, even though they hadn't even been built when he was alive? Had his friend from the future told him about them? Or has the author, Ken Webster, simply goofed? And with that bit of the puzzle hanging in the air, let's take a break now. But if you could kindly use your box of lights to like, subscribe and share with friends who enjoy a good mystery, I'd be most grateful. And of course, you'll be able to see when the next investigations are posted. Anyway, back to Dodleston. In the next episode, Part 2, The Future, we'll meet this so-called friend, seemingly from the year 2109, and hear about a possible experiment with time that could explain all of these strange goings-on. I look forward to seeing you after the break. Until then, thank you for watching. Cheerio.
There are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamt of in our philosophy.